This is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyaradzi and also known as Mutos. Welcome to the Connection Desk. This is a diaspora discipleship movement which was initiated by Faith Ministries Zimbabwe. It involves people here in the US and Canada, but we also want to have a global reach in this diaspora discipleship movement that we are starting. And we're now in Acts chapter 4 in our study of the book of Acts. So I'll read Acts chapter 4 from verse 1 to 7 today. Acts chapter 4 verses 1 through to 7. The priests and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to Peter and John while they were speaking to the people. They were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. They seized Peter and John, and because it was evening, they put them in jail until the next day. But many who heard the message believed, and the number of men grew to about 5,000. The next day, the rulers, elders, and teachers of the law met in Jerusalem. Annas, the high priest, was there, and so were Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and the other men of the high priest's family. They had Peter and John brought before them and began to question them. By what power or what name did you do this? So the focus for this session will be the Sanhedrin, because this is the body that is called the Sanhedrin, and Peter and John are brought before the Sanhedrin, and they are made to answer, they are asked a question. By what power did you do this? What are we talking about? We're talking about the cripple who was in the temple, who was at the temple gate, and he was healed, and he began to run and leap. And when they came in and they saw this event, they arrested Peter and John. Why did they arrest them? Because it says they were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. So this brings us immediately to the issue of the resurrection of the dead and why somebody would be arrested because of teaching about the resurrection of the dead. So the Sadducees are the part of the group, the priests that came and arrested Peter and John were part of the Sadducees. It says that in verse 1. They came and, a first century Christian would have understood immediately when you talk about the Sadducees, they do not believe in the resurrection. Let's talk a little bit more about the Sadducees. The Sadducees, they were dominant in the Sanhedrin. Religiously, they refused to go beyond the Torah, and they also rejected the oral law. So they believed only in the Torah. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the first 5 books that Moses wrote. So in some instances, you might have come across the term Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And in the Septuagint, they will call it the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books, but it's the Greek name for the Torah. But we will use the term Torah for our purposes today. So they refused to go beyond the Torah, and they rejected the oral law. The ideas of bodily resurrection and the immortality of the soul, these were ideas that came later, or that became prominent later in Jewish thinking, later than the Torah. And it was associated with prophetic teaching particularly, and you see it in the prophetic writings, and you also see it in the in the intertestamental period between the testaments, it's sometimes called the 400 silent years, the resurrection teaching became more and more prominent, and it was generally accepted by the time of the Lord Jesus Christ, the first century. Daniel brings out this whole teaching most clearly in the Old Testament. For example, in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2, you hear this. Daniel says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." So there were some books that, as I said, in between the testaments, which were accepted as general literature by the Jewish people, and teaching that they accepted, and again that idea became much more prominent during the intertestamental period. Politically, the Sadducees were seen as Rome's political servants. They were seen by the people as political players. And why that? They were a pro-political party made up of priests. The priests had ruled at some point, I think it was from about 140, somewhere in the 140s BC, up to about 67 BC. We find that the priests overthrew the Greek leaders, Antiochus, Epiphanes, and so on. They removed them, and they managed to get back the temple. And there was a period in which Israel was ruled by the priests, the Maccabees, or the Asmoneans. The Asmonean was the family name for the Maccabees. So they began to rule, and they got into a political space as well. And this political space, they never quite left it. So even when the Romans came in, they were still operating as part of the Roman system, and they became part of the patronage system of Rome, and they owed their power to Rome. So it's patron-client, where the patron is the one who gives you the power, and you give them their loyalty, and you do what the patron wants. So the patron would be Rome, and they became the political elites in Israel, and they were really governing on behalf of the Romans in many ways. And they also became corrupt, just as typical of most worldly systems. They became corrupt. That's why they were not liked. And also the other thing is, they came from the elite classes, more social and economic power than most people, and worldly. They were generally regarded as worldly and commercial, and biblically they were not very strong in terms of their religious convictions, and they could be shaped, or they could be moved around. They were very malleable politically. So those were the Sadducees, and the Sadducees were part of the Sanhedrin. Let me explain. Another group in the Sanhedrin was the Pharisees, and I'll explain a little bit more about what the Sanhedrin consisted of. The Pharisees, on the other hand, had the favor of the masses, and their desire was to keep the law. They expounded on the law, and their desire to keep it they added other laws in their desire to keep the law, almost like commentaries. And so they then added little things like, okay, we talk about fasting, but they come up with how you should fast, relating to fasting, ritual cleansing, Sabbaths, tithes, and all sorts of little things in terms of practice. How do you actually do these things? So they were very devout, and as far as they were concerned, political freedom was not necessary, and it could be a diversion. And so for them, the most important thing is to do what God had called them to do, and they separated the religious from the political life. So for the Pharisees, power derived from their holiness code, where people saw them as people who really were serious about following God and about the law. And they were the teachers of the law, the scribes, the experts in the law. and they would be the ones who would be teaching the people. So the Sanhedrin could best be described as a senior council or a board. And in New Testament times, there were 70 members in that council, 24 chief priests, 24 elders, and 22 scribes or lawyers. As I said, the priests would be coming from the Sadducees mostly, and then the scribes and lawyers would be coming from the Pharisees, and plus the high priest would share it. So the first occurrence that we see, it seems to be in the time of King Jehoshaphat in the Old Testament. And when you read 2 Chronicles chapter 19 verse 8 to 9, it says, "In Jerusalem also Jehoshaphat appointed some of the Levites, priests, and heads of families, Israel families, to administer the law of the Lord and to settle disputes. And they lived in Jerusalem. He gave them these orders: you must serve faithfully and wholeheartedly in the fear of the Lord in every case that comes before you from your people who live in the cities, whether bloodshed or other concerns of the law, commands, decrees, or regulations. You are to warn them not to sin against the Lord. Otherwise his wrath will come on you and your people. Do this and you will not sin." So it seems like from that time on, there was this body that was to administer the law of the Lord and settle disputes. And that body became the Sanhedrin. This is all to say, this is the group that Peter and John were standing before. And Peter and John were young men. Jesus' disciples were probably in their 20s when they followed him and when they started following him. And in fact, John was probably in his teens. John seems to have been the youngest. He would probably have been in his teens. So if you can imagine these young men standing before the Sanhedrin and being asked this question: by what power or what name did you do this? This must have been a fearful moment for them. And it must have been a time when I'm sure the whole idea of making them stand before them was to intimidate. But we do not see them get intimidated. We'll talk about the events of the Sanhedrin meeting in the next session. God bless you. Looking forward to the next session with you.